I came home without my left arm, and I sat in the back of a cab at the end of my own driveway for almost 6 minutes, watching the porch light flicker against the dark, trying to convince myself to open the door. The driver kept glancing at me in the mirror, not saying anything, just waiting. The meter long since stopped running because I'd already paid him double to sit there with me in silence. I could see her shadow moving behind the screen door, the shape of her crossing the living room twice, then a third time, and I knew she'd heard the cab pull in because the porch light had come on exactly 4 seconds after the engine cut off. And that was so completely her, so exactly the woman I'd fallen in love with 2 years earlier, that it almost undid me right there before I'd even touched the door handle. My sleeve was pinned up at the shoulder, folded and clipped the way the physical therapist had shown me, because I hadn't been fitted for the prosthetic yet, and some childish, terrified part of me had refused to wear the temporary one home. Like if I just didn't look at the absence too directly, it might not be permanent. I kept running my right hand along my jaw, an old nervous habit, except now even that felt lopsided, because my body had spent 30 years assuming it had 2 hands to fidget with, and only one of them had shown up to the homecoming. The driver finally asked if I wanted him to wait a little longer, and I said no. And I said it the way you say something when you're trying to convince yourself more than the person you're talking to. I got out. I stood at the bottom of the steps with my duffel bag hanging off my right shoulder, the strap cutting into muscle that used to share the weight, and I looked up at that porch, the one with the swing we'd hung ourselves the summer before I shipped out, the one where I'd promised her things I had no way of knowing whether I could keep. And I thought, this is it. This is the moment she finally sees what I've become. The screen door opened. Nora came out in bare feet, in one of my old t-shirts, her hair pulled back the way it always was when she'd been pacing for hours pretending not to wait for headlights. She didn't run. I want you to understand that, because I'd imagined 100 different versions of this moment in that hospital bed in Germany, and in every single one of them, she either ran to me, and I braced for her to flinch when she got close enough to really see, or she stood frozen at the door, taking it in, deciding. What she actually did was walk. Slow, deliberate, like she'd rehearsed it. Like every step down those porch stairs was something she was choosing on purpose, instead of something her body was doing for her. She crossed the yard. She stopped right in front of me, close enough that I could smell the lavender detergent she always used. And for one terrible second, neither of us said anything, the cicadas going off in the dark, like they didn't know what was happening 6 feet away from them. Then Nora knelt down. Not because she needed to look up at me. I'm 6'1" and she's 5'5". Kneeling didn't make sense by any normal logic, but she knelt anyway, right there in the grass in her bare feet, and she took my right hand in both of hers, and she looked up at me with her eyes already wet, and she whispered, "I fell in love with you, not your arm." I didn't say anything back. I couldn't, but to understand why that one sentence cracked something open in my chest that I'd spent 11 months bracing shut, you have to go back further than that porch, back before the blast, before Landstuhl, before any of it, back to a diner on a Tuesday night 2 years earlier, when I was 26 years old, and still had both hands, and absolutely no idea what was coming. I met Nora at a place called Birdie's, a 24-hour diner 2 towns over from base, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox that only half worked, and I was there at 11 at night because I couldn't sleep and the barracks felt like a box closing in on me. She was sitting alone in the corner booth grading papers, a red pen capped between her teeth, kindergarten worksheets spread out in front of her like she was diffusing something delicate. And when the waitress brought my coffee, she dropped a napkin on the floor by accident, and Nora caught it with her foot before it slid under my table. This small, unthinking, reflexive kindness that somehow told me everything I needed to know about her before we'd exchanged a single word. I made some dumb joke about her secret ninja skills. She didn't laugh right away. She just looked at me for a second too long, like she was deciding whether I was worth the energy of a response. And then she said, completely deadpan, "Black belt in classroom management, actually," and went back to her papers like the conversation was over. It wasn't over. I asked if I could sit. She said, The booth was technically county property, and she couldn't grant permission, but she didn't move her bag off the seat across from her either, which I took as a yes, and we talked until Birdie's closed at 2, and the night manager had to physically turn off half the lights to get us to leave. I found out she taught kindergarten at the elementary school on Hollis Street, that she'd grown up 2 counties over, that she hated coffee but drank it anyway, because she liked having something to hold on to during long conversations, that her father had been Army too, retired now, and that she had very specific and very strong opinions about the right way to fold a fitted sheet. I found out I could make her laugh, really laugh, the kind that made her cover her mouth like she was embarrassed by how loud it came out, and I found out that I wanted to keep doing that for as long as anyone would let me. We dated for 8 months before I told her I loved her, and even then I said it badly, standing in the rain outside her apartment because my truck wouldn't start, and I'd walked the last 1.5 miles just to see her, soaked through, shivering, and she opened the door and started laughing at the state of me, and I just blurted it out. No build-up, no plan, I love you, by the way, in case that wasn't obvious from the fact that I walked through a thunderstorm for cold pizza. She went very still. Then she pulled me inside by the front of my wet shirt and said, "Took you long enough." And that was that. I should tell you about the day she met my mother too, because it tells you almost everything about who Nora is. My mother has never been an easy woman to impress. She raised me alone after my father left when I was 9, and she developed this habit over the years of testing the people I brought home, small, quiet tests nobody else would even notice were happening. She invited Nora to Sunday dinner about 2 months into us dating, and halfway through the meal, my mother, completely deadpan, asked Nora what she'd do if I ever came home from deployment different. Not physically, just different, harder, quieter, changed in the ways combat changes people. I remember freezing at the table, furious at my mother for asking something so loaded on only the second time they'd ever met. But Nora didn't even blink. She set her fork down, looked my mother dead in the eye, and said, "I'd learn the new version of him the same way I'm learning this version. People aren't fixed points, Mrs. Hargrove. They're directions. I'm not in this for a snapshot." My mother didn't say anything for a long moment, and then she got up, walked into the kitchen, and came back with a second helping of pie for Nora before anyone had even asked, which in my family is the closest thing to a blessing that exists. I didn't understand the full weight of that conversation until years later, sitting in a hospital bed in Germany, replaying it in my head like a lifeline I hadn't known I was holding on to. We hung the porch swing at her parents' old place that summer, the house she'd bought from them when they downsized, sanded the wood ourselves on a Saturday afternoon, with the radio playing something neither of us remembers now, and that swing became our place, the spot where we had every important conversation that summer, where I told her about wanting to make this permanent someday, where she told me about her mother's illness when she was a kid and how it had taught her that some things you just don't get advance warning for. 3 weeks before I deployed, we sat on that swing until almost 4 in the morning, and I gave her my spare set of dog tags. Not a ring. I wasn't ready for that yet, and we both knew it. But something that meant, I'm coming back for this. And she wore them under her shirt every single day I was gone. I found that out later. Every single day for 11 months, until the day everything changed. The deployment itself was mostly the kind of boredom punctuated by adrenaline that nobody back home ever really understands. Long stretches of heat and dust and waiting, broken up by moments that made the waiting worth it just to survive them. Nora and I talked when we could, video calls that dropped out constantly, voicemails I'd listened to 3 or 4 times just to hear her voice in something other than my memory. And she sent actual letters too, real paper, because she said typing into a phone felt too disposable for the things she wanted to say. I kept every one of them in a metal box under my cot. The morning of the convoy, I almost didn't go. Not because of any premonition, nothing that dramatic, but because Coop, the guy in the vehicle behind mine, had asked to switch routes with me at the last second over something stupid about a card game debt, and for about 30 seconds I'd considered saying no just to make him sweat it. I said yes. I wish I could tell you there was some profound reason I changed seats, some instinct I should have trusted, but the truth is, It was nothing. It was nothing at all. And that's somehow the part that still keeps me up some nights. How a coin flip of a decision can rearrange the entire shape of your life. I don't remember the explosion itself. Not really. I remember the half-second before it, a strange pressure change in the air that some animal part of my brain registered as wrong, and then nothing. Then waking up to noise that didn't make sense yet, shouting, my own name being called from somewhere very far away, and then nothing again. I woke up properly 4 days later in a hospital in Landstuhl, Germany, with my mother's face hovering over me, her eyes red and swollen, and the first coherent thought I had, before pain, before confusion, before anything else, was that my left arm felt wrong, felt like it was still there but somehow also wasn't, this phantom fullness where there should have been emptiness, and it took the better part of an hour of someone gently explaining things to me before the information actually landed somewhere real. They'd saved everything they could. The blast had taken the arm below the shoulder, a combination of the initial impact and the surgery that followed to stop what they were losing. And I remember the surgeon, a quiet woman named Dr. Patel, sitting on the edge of my bed and telling me, very plainly, that I was going to be okay, that this was survivable, that people built full lives after this every single day. I believed her about the surviving part. I did not, for a long time, believe her about the full life part. And that disbelief is what almost cost me the best thing that had ever happened to me. Nora didn't know yet. The army had called my mother first as next of kin, and in the chaos of those first 72 hours, in the morphine fog, and the surgeries, and the sheer animal panic of being alive, in a body that no longer matched the one you'd left with, I made a decision I'm not proud of. I asked my mother not to tell her yet. I told myself it was because I wanted to be the one to explain it, that Nora deserved to hear it from me and not from a phone call delivered by someone else, and there was some truth in that, but underneath it was something uglier, something I didn't have the honesty to name at the time, which was that I was terrified, genuinely terrified, that the version of me coming home wasn't the version of me she'd fallen in love with, and some coward's instinct in me wanted to delay finding that out for as long as possible. I told my mother 3 days. Just give me 3 days to figure out how to say it. 3 days turned into 11. I called Nora exactly twice during that stretch, both times keeping the camera off, both times telling her I was fine, just busy, just dealing with some logistics, and I could hear in her voice that she didn't fully believe me, but she didn't push either, because that's who she is. She gives people room. On the 11th day, Coop, who'd ended up 2 beds down from me in the same ward with a leg injury that would heal clean in a few months, the same Coop whose seat I'd taken, wheeled himself over in the middle of the night when neither of us could sleep, and said something I still think about. He said, "You know, the longer you wait to tell her, the less it's about protecting her, and the more it's about protecting yourself." I told him to mind his own business. He laughed, this dry, exhausted laugh, and said, "I would, except you talk about her in your sleep, man, every single night. So technically, she is my business at this point." I didn't sleep at all after that. Around 4 in the morning, I called my mother and told her she could tell Nora the truth, all of it. And I asked her to do it gently. And I asked her to tell Nora I'd call as soon as I could. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until much later, was that I was already too slow, that my mother, in her own grief and worry, had let something slip to my sister Beth 2 days earlier, and Beth, unable to carry it alone, had told Nora's best friend, who, in the way these things travel through small towns, had told Nora herself nearly 24 hours before my mother's gentle phone call ever happened. Nora had already known. She'd known and said nothing, because she was waiting for me to be ready to tell her myself, and I had no idea, not even the faintest idea, how much that single fact was about to matter. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life, harder in some ways than the explosion itself, because pain you can survive minute by minute, but shame is a slower kind of damage. It works on you over time. I started pulling away from her in earnest, once she knew the truth, telling myself it was kindness, telling myself I was giving her an easy way out before she had to find the hard way herself. Our calls got shorter. I stopped picking up some nights entirely. let them go to voicemail. Told myself she'd understand it was the medication, the physical therapy schedule, the time difference once they moved me stateside to Walter Reed. She kept calling anyway. She kept leaving messages that never once mentioned the arm, never once asked the question I was so afraid of, the question of whether she still wanted this slower, harder, different version of the future we'd planned on that porch swing. Instead, her messages were about small things, about a kid in her class who'd lost his first tooth in the middle of story time, and how the whole room had erupted into chaos. About a leak under her kitchen sink she'd fixed herself with a video tutorial, and entirely too much confidence. About the dog tags, how she still wore them, how she'd started sleeping with the porch light on, because some nights it was the only thing that made the house feel less empty. I listened to every single one of those messages more times than I'd ever admit, and I still didn't call her back the way I should have. About 6 weeks into my time at Walter Reed, deep into the brutal, humbling work of learning how to do 100 ordinary tasks with one hand, learning how to be fitted and trained on a prosthetic that felt at first like wearing someone else's limb, I finally worked up the nerve to ask her, over a call I almost hung up on 3 separate times before she picked up, whether she wanted me to come home at all. I asked it like that, flat out, brutal, because some part of me thought ripping the bandage off fast would hurt less than the slow unraveling I'd been doing for weeks. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I thought the call had dropped, and then she said, very quietly, "Eli, I need you to listen to me, and I need you to actually hear it this time." I told her I was listening. She said, "I have been preparing for you to come home different since the day Beth's text came through. Not preparing to leave, preparing to help. There's a difference, and I think you've gotten those two things confused somewhere in that hospital, and I am genuinely getting a little tired of having to keep proving I'm not going anywhere." I asked her what that meant, preparing to help, and she got quiet again, almost shy, which wasn't like her, and she said there was a Wounded Warrior family support program that ran out of a clinic 40 minutes from her, that she'd been driving there twice a week for over a month, learning how prosthetics work, how to help with the parts of daily life that take adjusting, how to be useful instead of just sympathetic, because sympathy, she said, wasn't going to be enough for either of us long term, and she refused to be a person who only offered the easy kind of love. I didn't know what to say. I think I just sat there on the edge of my hospital bed with the phone pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark. And somewhere in my chest, something that had been clenched tight for 6 weeks finally, slightly, started to loosen. The training itself was its own slow education in humility. They started me on a basic mechanical prosthetic before moving to anything more sophisticated, and the occupational therapist, a patient, no-nonsense woman named Renata, who'd worked with hundreds of guys like me, made me practice the most mundane tasks imaginable until they stopped feeling impossible. Tying a shoe, buttoning a shirt, cutting a piece of chicken without sending it skidding off the plate. I remember the specific humiliation of the first time I tried to open a jar of peanut butter in the shared kitchen at Walter Reed and couldn't manage it, not even close, and slamming it down on the counter harder than I meant to, and a guy 2 tables over, missing both legs below the knee, not even looking up from his own breakfast, said, "Welcome to the club, man. Give it 3 weeks." He was right. 3 weeks later, I opened that same jar without thinking about it at all, and it felt like winning something enormous that nobody outside that kitchen would ever understand the size of. Renata used to say that grief and skill building happen on the same timeline whether you like it or not, that you don't get to finish mourning what you lost before you start learning what you have. The two things just run side by side, awkward and overlapping, and some days one of them is louder than the other. Some nights, I'd lie in that hospital bed, doing the strange arithmetic of phantom sensation, feeling fingers that weren't there anymore, curl into a fist that didn't exist, and I'd think about Nora's hands, how she used to lace her fingers through mine on that porch swing, and wonder if there would ever be a version of that gesture again that didn't feel like a math problem with a missing variable. Even knowing what Nora had told me on that call, even hearing her say it in her own voice, the fear didn't fully let go of me, not yet, because fear like that doesn't operate on logic. It operates on its own stubborn timeline. I had 2 more months of recovery and training ahead of me before they'd clear me to travel home for good. And during that stretch, I had what I can only describe as a slow, uneven climb back toward believing her. 2 steps forward most days, 1 step back on the bad ones. The days when the prosthetic chafed and the phantom pain flared, and I caught my own reflection in a window and didn't recognize the silhouette looking back at me. Coop became something like a mentor during those months, which still makes me laugh, considering he was the reason I'd switched seats in that convoy in the first place. But he'd been through his own version of this with his leg, and one night, maybe a week before my discharge papers came through, he said something that I still carry with me. He said, "Everybody who loves you is going to ask you the same question eventually, whether they say it out loud or not. The question isn't whether you're whole, it's whether you're going to let them love the parts of you that are actually there, instead of grieving out loud over the part that isn't, every single day for the rest of your life." I didn't have a good response for that. I just nodded, because he was right, and being right about something doesn't always come with an easy way to act on it. In the final weeks, Nora and I talked almost every day again, real conversations, not performances of fine, and slowly, I let her further in, told her about the phantom pain, about how strange it was to reach for things with a hand that wasn't there anymore, about the particular humiliation of needing help with buttons some mornings. She never flinched in her voice when I told her these things. She asked questions instead, practical ones. What helps, what doesn't, what she should know before I came home. And somewhere in those conversations, I started to understand what Coop meant, that loving someone fully isn't a single grand gesture. It's 100 small willingnesses stacked on top of each other. And Nora had been stacking hers for months while I was still trying to decide if I deserved them. Which brings me back to that driveway, that cab idling in the dark, those 6 minutes I sat there with my hand on the door handle and couldn't make myself open it. I had exactly that long, 6 minutes, before the driver would have to ask if I wanted him to take me somewhere else instead, and some small, exhausted, terrified part of me genuinely considered saying yes, take me anywhere but here, because at least uncertainty felt safer than finding out for real. I got out anyway. I stood at the bottom of those porch steps with my duffel bag pulling on my good shoulder, and I watched her come down those stairs barefoot in my old t-shirt, slow and deliberate. And I want you to understand that in the version of this story I'd built in my head during those long nights at Walter Reed, I always imagined having to convince her, always imagined needing to make some kind of case for myself. Here's what I can still do. Here's how I'll adapt. Please don't go. That isn't what happened. She crossed the yard, stopped close enough that I could smell the lavender on her skin, and before I could say a single rehearsed word, she knelt down in the wet grass in her bare feet and took my one remaining hand in both of hers and looked straight up at me, and her eyes were already filling, and she whispered it, slow, like she'd been saving the exact words for this exact moment for 11 months. "I fell in love with you, not your arm." I didn't say anything back. Not because I didn't have words, but because for the first time since the explosion, words felt completely unnecessary. She didn't say anything else either. Neither of us did. We just stayed like that, her kneeling, me standing, the porch light throwing this soft gold halo around both of us, the cicadas filling up the silence neither of us needed to fill ourselves. And somewhere in that quiet, I felt the last piece of the fear I'd been carrying for 2 months. Finally, completely, let go. After a while she stood up, and she reached for the strap of my duffel bag without asking, the way she always used to before all this, an old habit neither of us had to think about. And I almost stopped her, almost said something about how I could still carry it myself, and then I caught myself and let her take it instead, because I was starting to understand, right there on that lawn, that the difference between accepting help and losing yourself was a lot smaller than I'd spent 2 months convincing myself it was. We walked up to the porch together. She sat me down on that swing we'd hung ourselves 2 summers earlier, the wood a little weathered now, a little softer at the edges, and she sat beside me, tucking her bare feet up underneath her the way she always did. And she didn't ask me a single question about the arm that night. She just held my hand, the one that was still there, and we rocked slowly in the dark. And at some point she rested her head against my shoulder, my right shoulder, the one that still worked exactly the way it always had. And I remember thinking that this, exactly this, was the homecoming I'd been too afraid to believe in. It wasn't instantly easy after that. I want to be honest about that part, because love stories like to end on the porch swing and pretend everything smooths out from there. But real life doesn't work that cleanly. There were hard mornings in the months that followed, mornings when the prosthetic rubbed wrong and I snapped at her over something small and unrelated, mornings when I caught myself avoiding mirrors, evenings when old friends would stare a half-second too long at my sleeve before catching themselves, and I'd come home from those encounters carrying a heaviness I didn't always know how to put down. But Nora kept doing exactly what she'd promised on that lawn, kept showing up in the 100 small ways instead of the one big one, learned how to help me with the prosthetic straps on the mornings my fingers were too stiff to manage them myself, learned which restaurants had booths instead of tables because tables made certain tasks harder, learned, without ever making a production of it, when I needed help and when I needed her to simply step back and let me struggle through something on my own. About 4 months after I came home, on an ordinary Tuesday evening that didn't feel like it was building toward anything, we were sitting on that same porch swing, and I caught her watching me fix the chain on her bicycle, something fiddly that took both real patience and a fair amount of improvising with one hand and the stump of the other. And when I finally got it working and looked up, she was smiling at me in this quiet, unguarded way, and she said, "You know, I used to worry about whether you'd let me in. I never once worried about whether you'd figure things out. You always figure things out." I asked her what the difference was. She thought about it for a second, twirling one of my dog tags between her fingers, the ones she still wore, even though I was home now, even though there was no longer a need for a token to stand in for me. And she said, "The arm was never the hard part, Eli. You were the hard part. The arm I could learn. You, I just had to wait for you to let me love." I didn't have a response for that one either, not a clever one anyway. So I just pulled her in against my side with my good arm, and we sat there until the porch light buzzed on by itself in the dark. And I thought about Coop's voice in that hospital ward at 4 in the morning, about how he'd told me everybody who loves you is eventually going to ask whether you'll let them love the parts of you that are actually there. And I thought about how long it had taken me to understand that Nora had answered that question for herself, months before I'd even worked up the courage to ask it. The wedding happened that following spring, 8 months after the night on the lawn, small and unfussy, the way we both wanted it. Folding chairs borrowed from the elementary school where Nora taught, a string of lights her students had helped decorate the porch railings with as a class project that none of the parents quite understood the significance of. My mother cried through the entire ceremony, which surprised exactly no one. Coop flew in on crutches that had finally replaced the wheelchair, stood up as my best man, and during his toast, told the entire backyard the story of switching seats in that convoy. The story I'd never had the nerve to tell most of these people myself. And instead of the room going quiet and awkward the way I'd feared, Nora reached over under the table and squeezed my hand, the same hand she'd held kneeling in the grass. And the whole yard just kept laughing and crying along with him, like it was the most natural story in the world to hear at a wedding. Because by then, it was simply part of who we were, not a wound we were protecting anymore, but a chapter we'd actually survived together. We said our vows on that same porch, barefoot in the grass again, this time on purpose, this time with an audience instead of just the cicadas. And when it came time for her vows, Nora didn't read from the paper she'd brought. She just looked at me and said the same 6 words she'd whispered the night I came home, slower this time, steadier, like she was laying a foundation instead of offering comfort. These days, I don't pin my sleeve up anymore. I don't hide the prosthetic under long jackets even in the dead of summer. I let kids at the grocery store ask their blunt, curious kid questions about my arm, and I answer them honestly, because somewhere along the way, I stopped treating it like a secret I owed anyone an apology for. Nora still teaches kindergarten on Hollis Street, still hates coffee and drinks it anyway, still fixes things around the house with more confidence than expertise, and most evenings, when the weather lets us, we end up back on that same porch swing, the wood a little more worn now, the chain that holds it up the same one we hung with our own 4 hands. Well, 6 hands originally, 2 of mine, and 4 of hers if you count the ones that came before this whole story even started. If you've ever loved someone so much that you tried to push them away to spare them the harder version of yourself, you already know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you've ever been the one who refused to leave when someone tried, you already know exactly why I married her 8 months after that night on the lawn, in a small backyard ceremony with that same porch as the backdrop, both of us barefoot in the grass again, this time on purpose. She still says it sometimes, late at night, half asleep, her head on my chest. No real reason for it, just a quiet habit now instead of a declaration. The same 6 words that knelt down in wet grass and changed the entire shape of my fear into something I could finally put down. I fell in love with you, not your arm. I used to think that sentence was about the night she said it. I understand now it was never really about one night at all. It was about every single ordinary day after it. The ones nobody films, the ones nobody puts in a story, the slow, unremarkable, devoted accumulation of a woman choosing the same thing over and over, quietly, without an audience, until one day you look up and realize the choosing never stopped. And somewhere in all that quiet, ordinary choosing, that's where the real homecoming actually was.